And yes, I'm following some of the lines that I made, but I'm really trying to let this shadow shape evolve as I'm painting it, so that it's referring to the angle of light, yes. At the same time, I'm thinking about the shapes that I'm leaving behind as just as important, the quality of the shapes. So they're describing the light, they're describing the surface that they rest on, they're also describing the sort of joy that I have in using a brush in this fashion. So this is the scene of the Commonwealth Avenue Mall, and it's serving as our inspiration for today's piece. But I want to make some changes. This is the photograph that I shot, but it's a little too far away. So I want to zoom in. These are some of the things that I think about before deciding on an image or a view, is how to crop it or how to make best use of what's here. I want to get a little closer to that statue but still see the length of the shadows. I want to do a vertical piece, so I'm going to also come in from the side and crop some of the trees out so that I get a what I consider a good composition based on the photograph that I took. We can always move ourselves in nature and do this sort of thing with the sketchbook, but I wanted to show you sort of the the guidance that or the path that I took to create this image even before bringing it to paper. So I made a few changes to the image, decided on a view that looks good. The statue is a little off center, a little low in the painting, a little to the left. That gives me more opportunity to play with the light on the right-hand side and above. A nice kind of path of light downward as well, meeting the ground in the distance. So all these things combine to give me what I feel is a good composition. So next we're going to move on to the drill using this image. All right, well, we've set up our scrap paper. We're doing a vertical format. I toyed with using a horizontal, but I'm going to go ahead and sketch this and do a tonal study of our subject. And we have some nice shadows. I'm just trying to sketch in the basics, get a feel for proportion, position. Big blocky shapes, which are good. The light is behind, which is also good. Putting it slightly off center. We don't need to do a lot of drawing for the trees. I think most of our work will be done as we paint them. And mostly thinking about light kind of coming down through here, falling on the ground, falling on our statue. Let's do this here. Yeah. It'd be nice to see a few people walking through. In any case, that's about the proportion. So let's think about our center of interest a little lower in the picture plane, a minor interest up above, the way the branches are breaking apart. Some interesting buildings beyond, not much. And I'm just going to use sepia, a single color, to do this tonal study. The painting itself is rather dark. Sepia. So I'm looking for paints of consistency. Painting Twilight, things are very muted, right? I mean, our image shows a little bit of drama, which I like. Okay, well, let's start by isolating the passage of light through here. We'll go with this medium strength. Using a very old brush to get started here, as you can tell, and we continue that with a little more sepia again, and we create a kind of pattern of shadows. Let's think about the pattern of shadows here. Here's the pattern of broken trees above, pattern of shadows. Just a little bit of liquid through here. All right, let's build on that with a smaller brush. This is a very old brush, which is good for this broken texture through here. We could use a fan brush also, just trying to get a little semblance of that sort of movement downward of light coming down into the scene. Through here. And I'm going to move to an old sablette brush to start to create some darks here. Now let's go a little darker with the paint. Sort of dry. Let's see. Here, I'll just lift this up here. Like so. And we'll start to create our, you can still see the drawing here for the most part. Going to start to create that statue. Pedestals, steps, sort of off center. His head would be looks like he's wearing a coat of some sorts. Maybe we can play that up a little bit. Reminds me of that Balzac statue. Balzac by Rodin. Okay, well, good enough for this study. And then I'm going to start to build in the surrounding elements and kind of start to join these two a little bit. Again, starting to use some dry brush. This particular painting is using a lot of dry brush, as you can tell. Something we've done, but not so, perhaps not so prevalent in our painting is this dry brush. But for these types of trees, it's appropriate, right? Dry brush up here, taking advantage of that rough textured paper. So we get a lot of broken strokes. That's basically today's idea, is to expand our repertoire through using a dry brush. And we're repeating some elements of these trees. Painting a very famous boulevard in Boston. This is the mall at Commonwealth Avenue. It's a very wonderful scene. Kind of served as a backdrop to our painting last week in a very abstract way. Mostly lined with elm, some sycamore, some other trees as well. It used to be one of the biggest stands of American elm until the blight. Creating depth and atmosphere in this manner. Okay, let's do this over here. Complement it. This side is closer to the statue, intentionally so. Yeah, right through here, like that. And this pattern that we created so haphazardly, randomly, starts to suggest some trees to my eye. And that's one reason I do it in this fashion, so that I'm not painting individual trees, but more like blocks or stands of trees. They can always, well, what we're doing now is we're dividing them. They can always be divided, and they can always be connected again too. But I like to go for this abstract quality early on, because it forms an exciting foundation, I feel. And it also, what it's doing is it's kind of suggesting to me what should follow. All right. Continue with this. Staying with that sort of mid-consistency for the moment. As it approaches us, getting just a bit darker, a little more thicker. And I'm mindful to leave some gaps in the trees. Also, you notice a little darker down below, a little more luminous up above. On this small sheet, it's hard to keep them the proper width. I feel like I'm getting it just a little thick. Something like this. Let's return to our center of interest here and go, a little darker in the upper part. You can even think about giving a little bit of relief. Well, it's really hard to tell from this particular photo where that relief might be. Good. Go a little darker through here. And a little bit here too. I'm going to drag one more shadow across here. That. Something like that. Okay. Let's start to work on some of these trees, introduce some of this dark, strong dark, here and there. Look how thick we're getting. This is an exercise in paint consistency. Start really where it's the darkest, in these lower trees. And as it goes higher, it kind of weakens naturally, weakens a little bit. Few branches with that darker quality to bring it forward. Let's introduce a little edging to the grassy area. The pathway, redefine the pathway, that same edging. Very conscious of the white spaces. We really want to get the height of the trees, the random quality in the branches. The shaping of the light. Lot of dry brush. Okay. Let's do this to the other side as well. Here as well. Probably not quite as dark on that side as we're doing through this section. But we can go darker. Especially a little lower down. Concentrate those lights, make them more powerful. Doing that. So what point is enough? As soon as you start to feel this sort of canopy, and we still have a lot of lights moving through there. That. This is our practice time. So if something compels you to try something a little different, I encourage you to do that. You never know what's going to result in a success, something a little better. Especially when you're doing a new project. We're doing a new project today, so. Like that. So we have this nice focal point through here. Now I want to create maybe just one more darkness here. Go with some full strength. And there's just a bit of extra darkness on the shoulders here. Coming against this light. Plus this helps to bring a certain gravity to this whole area. This contrast. So, right. I feel like it should be a little brighter on the path back here. Let's see if we can lift anything. Take all the water out of the brush. Come back here with just water. Let's see what we can do. Some colors are more stubborn than others. Yeah, this one is pretty stubborn. It's all right. No problemo. A little bit of light back there. And we can darken this area up too. Just taking water now over my path. Making the whole path have a little bit of tonality. So that drives our eye up a little higher in the painting. And I'm going to, while this is wet, I'm going to extend some of the shadows into the painting, into the ground, I'm sorry. Darker. Especially off of here. As they come forward, they diminish a little bit. Join it to the bottom here. Slightly better. Okay, so I put down a little bit of titanium white here. You can tell it's quite thick. Where would we use that? Well, shoulders is one good place. As the light comes down, head to. Any surface that's kind of facing up could use a little bit of that. Like this. I'm also wondering if we can lighten that area back there a little bit. It's always a little risky. But we're kind of getting a feel for this, so I feel it's worth the risk. Right. Can we do the same with some light just to see how it looks? Let's try this again with some white. Just to get an idea of what that's going to look like. So we're playing now. Just a little bit. All right. Why do we play like this? So it can give, some possibilities for the next painting. Maybe one more skinny shaft of light and about here. And it's going to dry paler. We can create it this way. We can also create it with lifting. But this color is very stubborn, so I think this is good enough. I'm going to try one more shadow before finishing. Just one more application for the shadow. Big brush, a little darker. And I want to get these shadows kind of strong as they come off, and then as they come towards us, they pale a little bit. This one spreads out a little bit. What am I thinking about? An interesting shape. That's an interesting shape. Let's go for a little more dark on this side. Okay. I'm going to try one more experiment, which is to put a smaller figure to give it scale. Probably be more, it's about there. More like this. Just want to experiment. This is all in the name of experiment. Welcome back, everybody. We're back at the table here looking at our tonal study, and what I want to do from this point is start to develop the image with a little more of a colorful palette, but pretty much following the tonal structure that we've created here. A deeper tonal painting, richer darks, not as much contrast as on a sunny day, a bright sunlit day. And the colors also will be a little muted, but we hope to achieve this passage of light through here and a feeling of the overhead trees nearing the end of autumn. So that's the goal, and I'm ready to start. I'm using a piece of Saunders Waterford 140 rough. This has a bit of tooth to it, which helps me to create these dry brush strokes. Well, we've got our piece of paper taped down, and we've made the changes to our image so that we can see it as it's going to look in our picture. We've cropped it, we've zoomed in, we've aligned it. So one of the first things I want to do is to create the basic shapes, the two basic shapes, the ground and sky. This is an important line, the horizon line, because it really puts the viewer in a position to see the subject in the way that we want to. In other words, if that horizon line is too high, we feel low to the subject. If it's too low, we feel high to the subject. So setting that first line is sort of critical, especially when you're in the field and you're trying to create this certain type of perspective. Seeing that line and understanding its relationship to the picture, the dimensions of the picture, is an important first step. So that's the first line we set. From this, we can start to build the smaller shapes of the pathway, the statue itself, the surrounding trees, any sort of figures that we want. It just becomes easier once we set those two shapes of sky and ground by determining the horizon line. So what you see me doing now is starting to create the shape of the statue. And it's an important shape because it gives a feeling of scale to the whole painting. So my first effort is it's a little big, so I'm going to reshape it and make it a bit smaller so that it feels proper to the height of the trees, proper to the width of the pathway. This can be done with tools, of course, but we do it by eye and by feel. And the more drawing that we do, the better we become at estimating proportion, placing the subject with some accuracy, and feeling good about the drawing. And that's an important part of this, is to feel good about the drawing before you start to paint. If there's something that feels off, even if you can't pinpoint what that something is, it can disrupt the painting process. Of course, we always, feel we can do better, but getting a level of comfort with your drawing is an important first step. So drawing itself, the practice of drawing, sketching, is an important one, and it's something that all the artists that I know, including myself, we do it on a almost daily basis, so that it's fluid, and this sort of practice really improves every aspect of your painting. In any case, you see me now moving outward from the statue, thinking about the width of the pathway, thinking about adding some figures, any sorts of adjustments. And in this particular piece, we don't do a lot of drawing. We're leaving a lot to brushwork. Very different than what we did last week when we painted the dog walker. There was a lot of drawing involved in that painting because we were doing recognizable creatures, specific breeds, objects that had a lot of detail, and to execute that detail in the drawing gives us confidence with the painting. In this particular piece, it's different because I would like it to, my end goal in this is to have a little more interest in the brushwork and in the sorts of effects that are created through dry brush, and seeing strength in building up the trees or in other objects. And so I want to let the brush sort of dictate that. I don't want to be constrained or have my watercolor fill a form. I want it to kind of grow organically, if that makes sense. So a lot of the drawing in this painting is simply to create the pathway, the horizon, and the statue and figures. Everything else will be very loose within the drawing, just some vague indications of treetops, distant treetops, and then we'll get into the painting part of it. So the statue here is feeling okay. I'm getting that corner that a major shadow comes off the corner of the pedestal, and I'm placing that with a little bit of darkness so that even if I paint over it, because the shadows will follow a little later in the painting, so I want to be able to see that point as a reference for my brushwork. So making it a little darker in the drawing helps me. And I've given myself several directionals to refer to the light source, also to kind of move us in a direction in the painting. I want us to kind of move from left to right and find the figures in the statue, the center of interest. Just to repeat, the center of interest is that area around the base of the statue, the right side of the statue. And so that helps me to edit, helps me to position the statue, even helps me to think about scale. I want it to align off-center. In other words, I don't want to put that statue directly in the middle of the painting because I feel that creates too much symmetry. That's a mistake with composition, is to have it too balanced, and that sort of symmetry creates a static quality, which for painting is that static quality means a kind of lifelessness or emptiness. So we create a little tension by placing these things in an offset manner. And composition is one of the big parts of painting that I like to teach and refer to because I don't see it practiced very often. And it really requires a lot of thought even before, doing your drawing. We crop the image a little bit. We move ourselves if we're outside. We think about zooming in. All these things start to relate to how we're going to compose the painting. And the reasons behind it are we want to create some tension, some movement via the directionals, and some other things that will relate to the brushwork, to the movement of light from the top down, and this sort of thing. Okay, well, speaking of brushwork, we're going to get into this first stage of the painting, and I'm looking at the statue, I'm looking at my study to get a feel for what sort of background element I want to use here. I'm going to be painting distant trees, the shapes of distant trees, with a rather bright application of burnt sienna. This burnt sienna is going to, later on in future layers, it's going to impart a sort of glow to the darks that I apply, and it's going to refer to this time of day where the light is very either honey-like or changing to a bit of pink, and this sienna does that color-wise. In terms of the brush, I'm using a very old brush that I have. It's kind of a specialty brush for me. It's just simply a mop that has been used a lot, and so the hairs kind of spray outward, and you'll see how this is helpful to me in creating a bit of texture. The paint quality is kind of a mid-tone, a warm mid-tone, and my approach is this is just sort of an underpainting, and I use this opportunity to start to create a bit of wildness to the trees, feeling of a growing object. And I'm working on rough paper, so look at the ends of the way that I finish these marks. They're very rough and broken. This sort of effect is going to be helpful in translating the feeling of light breaking through or coming through a broken object, such as tree branches. So I'm generating energy and generating a feeling for the shapes by doing this. This is my strategy. And another benefit to this, I feel, will be this warm color that's going to come through successive layers. So it's a little unorthodox, and as I said, part of it is technical, part of it is really strategy to push my mode of thinking into something more organic and free form, so that I'm not painting single trees. I'm really painting masses, and I'm not painting specific branches, but I'm letting the broken hairs on the brush sort of start to indicate that, which I can follow up on in successive layers. So this is basically dry brush technique, but with a little bit of um, sort of spontaneity. Really not using the brush as it's intended to be used. However, the craftsmen, the artists, they find unique ways of using tools, and that's how I look at this. It's just a unique way to use a tool, and I wouldn't recommend it for your new brushes or your expensive brushes, but a cheap mop that's seen many years of use can be extended in this fact. Just look at the head of this brush. It's really like just a spider or a dry mop that we're using to fray the ends of our object. So we bring it down a little further, and I want to get some feeling of connectivity, like we're painting a background. There are some whites left. The white of the path is the big one. Up above, the white of the sky is also important, and it's a kind of a fragmented white, also important. In this next application, I'm going to be doing the foreground and applying a graded wash to the foreground. Also very warm, using the same brush, but a lot more water, so that we'll get back to kind of a standard way of using the brush. Yellow ochre and a bit of leftovers and a little bit of ultramarine blue to create a warm gray. Up above was simply sienna. Maybe a bit of cad yellow, I'm not sure, but below we're making kind of a mixture of a warm gray. And to do that, I'm using mostly yellow ochre, a little bit of ultramarine blue, really putting a lot of water with this mixture, so you can tell that the brushwork, the approach to the brushwork is very different. I'm keeping it pale back by my statue because this is my center of interest. I want to keep the contrast high back there, so to keep it light, very, very light, is important. And then to follow that by adding some darks, using a bit of lavender now with the stronger yellow ochre in the foreground, darkening it up so that we get a feeling of depth from this graded wash, a feeling that the path is going from under our feet to far away. So we create that depth, that illusion of depth, with this graded wash. And I'll keep bringing up the color. My paper is at an angle so that the color tends to slide downward, gather downward, which is useful for a graded wash, but I want to keep it a little darker up there, so I'll continue to bring that pigment upwards until I feel I can step away. I'll adjust this wash. While it's shiny, while it's very shiny like this, I can continue to adjust it. And at this point, it's starting to look pretty good, so maybe add a little more before moving on. Well, these early stages always look sort of unplanned and wild and senseless because there's not much defined yet. We're just creating energy and movement. But that energy and movement, it forms a sort of foundation that we can settle. We can settle this by starting to shape some areas, give some lines, some definite trees, etc. We'll put on a foundational wash of this same burnt sienna, a little stronger of course, right into the statue. just so that we have it in place. We want the statue to also have a sort of glowing quality, and so this serves as an underpainting as well as giving us a definite placement of the shadow. I have switched to a different brush. As you notice, this is a sablette with a fine point, and this allows me to kind of control the edges. I have to paint from the back of the brush because below the statue it's very wet, and I don't want to I shouldn't rest my hand at this point. I should just build up the shape, bring it down to meet that wash, and then we'll let everything dry before we move on to the next stage. Even though we're painting into a wet area, we're using a brush that does not have a lot of paint, so it's not going to bleed out at the bottom there. It's just simply going to rest. And this is enough for this stage. We've accomplished a couple things. We got a nice active background. We've got a feeling of the trees and branches overhead. We've created that graded wash for the path. This we could have done at a later stage also. In fact, we did that in our drill where we painted the shadows first and we painted this graded wash second. But I think I want to try it this way in this case. Here's how that upper section has dried. We can see the resulting brushwork that is chaotic, but at the same time, I feel it speaks to the essence of light coming through those dried branches of our elm trees. And there's enough of a reference that I can build on this. And in this next stage, we're working on dry paper again. We've let the painting dry off. We're going to start to shape the canopy with a darker mixture of burnt sienna, a little bit of ultramarine blue, and build up the canopy in a similar fashion. We're going to be using dry brush again on top of this to start to build up the trunks of our trees, painting more individual trees, and carry that up to the canopy, and start to shape the sort of passageway or the area of light through the center of our park, creating a sort of that circular focal point or that circular composition that we're looking for. And then once this is done, once this is set up, we'll start to create the shadows coming across the walkway. So that's what the plan is at this stage. And we have to be a little bit brave here to work with a darker color and in such a chaotic fashion. We have to trust or gamble, let's say gamble, that this is going to work out. But I like to approach things with a little bit of uncertainty. Sometimes that brings out, very often that brings out something very new. And I suspect that this way will work out. So I have a sense that this is going to work out. That's enough for me to go forward. If it doesn't, well, there's numbers of ways to create any one image. I want to use this as an opportunity to kind of build on a technique that I've been experimenting with, which is this dry brush quality. And so you see me starting in a little less of a frantic approach with the brushwork. In other words, my strokes are definitely using darker paint, but they're more settled, and they're starting to actually bring out the idea of vertical elements rising up and again breaking up as they reach the upper part of the painting. So they're starting to build up this idea of trees. And following in some part the underpainting, the movement that was created in the underpainting. Once we start to see trees, individual trees emerging in this, we'll switch over to a smaller brush and bring those out with a little more clarity. Up above, I would like to keep it rather vague and abstract in this sort of broken fashion. Well, as we move through the painting, we'll see how that happens. You can tell I'm using that same brush. It's an old friend who I'm personifying him, but they sort of become like characters for the artist. Any sort of tool that produces the mark that you're looking for becomes a trusted and valuable friend, because there's no surprises. It feels right in your hand. It leaves the sort of mark that you want, and you grow with that. You start to become attached to your tools in this way. They start to perform for you. And even though this one, this particular brush, has seen better days in terms of brush quality or brush life, it's still purposeful. It has this ability to kind of fragment, which I like. The hairs spread apart and create marks that are intentional, but always have their own life to them. They move in a slightly different way than I don't really have an expectation. I expect that they will fray and give me these sorts of broken marks. When I want a really definite tree trunk or a definite branch or a definite space between the trees, I'll use a wetter, sharper brush for that. But at this point, I just want to create that sparkly energy that depicts the twilight hour, when the sun is just starting to dip below the horizon, and we get a very intense directional light, a low light that creeps through the trees and is so bright that it just seems to dissolve the forms that we see, the objects that we see. So here I've added a bit of water to my mixture, and I'm painting distant buildings, distant trees in a very wet fashion. This is to just give myself a little bit of definite edges to the background. The mixture is quite diluted, so even though it looks dark now, it's going to dry quite pale. And I'm adding a little bit of cool color in this lavender to help it recede as well. Bring that down and define that beginning of the path that's beyond the statue, and in essence concentrate that white area where I'm going to be placing figures and shadows, and basically using as a center of interest. Okay, so again, this is a little unorthodox in terms of how most people would create this scene. But I believe it can yield some interesting textures. Certainly, it speaks to the essence of Twilight and allows me to create this sort of broken light that I would like to have in this particular scene. And I know that I can pull some trees out of this, and will do so. Um, as that area starts to dry, I'm going to return with even stronger darks and start to build up the forms of trees, return to the canopy and create some limbs, this and that, but it'll continue to be sort of dry work. So I need this upper section to dry. While it dries, I'm going to tackle this difficult passage of foreground shadows. And they're important marks to me. There's something that I would like to, I guess, execute with a little bit of flair. Okay, so I've moved now to the smaller brush and started to build thickness to the trees. I'm concentrating on those little spots of orange that come between the trees. So I'm building a stand of trees out of this sort of chaotic mush. And the trees, what I'm doing here is joining them side by side, while concentrating those little orange pieces of light that are coming through. So I'm thickening up the trees. Do the same up above, where I'm creating some more definite branches using this smaller brush, and starting to create a richer depth to the canopy. By doing this, I bring some branches forward. At the same time, those that have already been painted start to recede. And I do this in a dry fashion, so you see me taking out occasionally some of the paint in my brush so that I have even less paint and my brush can kind of skid along the surface and give me a dry mark. That means that the edges are broken, and the result of this is much like our dry brush. To precede this area, we get a feeling of light fragmenting the object. The pace has slowed down quite a bit, hasn't it? So we're more deliberate, more focused on creating some individual branches, individual trees, also focused on those bits of light coming through the trees. The mixture you see me using is a little ultramarine blue, a little bit of lavender, and more of the burnt sienna. So the marks are a little darker, definitely darker, and a little bit cooler. I will show a couple individual trees with some real strong darks, but for now, more like a stand of trees that's occasionally broken by light coming through. At this point, I'm really not looking at the reference I do have my tonal studied there, but my eyes are really glued to what's happening in the painting itself and trying to let the painting evolve from the underpainting that we did. So it has a connection to that and builds upon that. I find that that's preferable to uh, following the image or the study too much, because there's always going to be divergence, and if the artist is sensitive to that, then uh, the painting grows in its own way, and this is a good way for the painting to evolve. We want to add a bit of this color to the left side and start to build, some stronger trees into the left side as well. Most of the contrast, actually, since the right light is coming from the right side, will be in the right side of the trees, but we need some of these trees on the left to come forward as well. So extend this wash by adding a few more darks into that section. Okay, so you can see we've created this rolling, broken shape of branches and trunks of trees, etc. What I want to do now is to start to create the shadows that move across the bottom. And we have two choices. One is hard edge. This is what we did up above, where we worked on dry paper and place the edges with hard edges. We could also wet this area and do soft edges. I think I'm going to try it with the hard edges. So let's think about that. Let's go in with some hard edged lines here and try to get our shadows. And then we'll continue by building into the statue a little more and finalize some of the darks in the trees. Up to this point, we've only destroyed one brush, creating all the branches above. I'm using another mop brush here as I'm starting to plan the attack for my shadows. And the work that I want to do in the shadows is I want to get it done in one go so that I don't have to revisit the shadows and try to place them again along the same lines. That can be done, but I always feel it's a bit awkward and a little heavy-handed, so I'm going to try and execute these a la prima in the first go. And what that means is choosing the right brush, building up the paint consistency to what you think it should be, and then just going for it and believing that it's going to work out. So I've mixed up a cooler gray using some lavender, some sepia, and a little bit of ultramarine blue. Gives me a dark gray that's rather cool. And I recognize the lines that I created in my drawing as sort of guideposts to get me started. As I said, that line coming off the pedestal of the shadow is important. And I go between using the body of the brush, the heel of the brush, to the tip of the brush for some of the finer marks. And yes, I'm following some of the lines that I made, but I'm really trying to let this shadow shape evolve as I'm painting it, so that it's referring to the angle of light, yes. At the same time, I'm thinking about the shapes that I'm leaving behind as just as important, the quality of the shapes. So they're describing the light, they're describing the surface that they rest on, they're also describing the sort of joy that I have in using a brush in this fashion. So all that combines in this, couple of minutes of creating these shadows. It's really like a performance. And the result is quite strong. So as this dries, I think you'll be able to see and understand the sort of preparation, the sort of target that I have as I'm making the marks, and the sort of attitude also that goes into these marks that are creating shadows and also expressing the direction of the light. Well, that's an intense moment in the life of this painting, and I'm stepping back and kind of looking at it. I like it. Um, where do I want to go from here? If the paint is still wet, so if these particular shadows are slightly darker as they come off of the tree, and then as they come towards us, they fade a little bit. Any sort of adjustment or blending I'll do while it's wet. But I'm careful not to preserve those light areas. I really want to keep those light areas because they describe to me with a great deal of energy and interest the path of light, the sort of low twilight quality of those long shadows in the moment before the sun dips behind the horizon. I'm not resting my hand on the paper because these shadows are still wet, but I want to keep this sort of brush energy or the sort of quality that I was describing in the creation of these marks. I want to keep that going. I want to build on that, and so I'm going for the dark passages in the statue, mixing in ultramarine blue, a little bit of sepia, and a little bit of lavender as well. And as you notice, I'm keying on some of those brighter marks of light falling on the edges of the statue, whether it be a forward edge or the shoulders or anything. I let this dark passage break up a little bit. And this is very closely related to the center of interest, so I'm returning to the center of interest and starting to redefine this, put this area of the painting in a finished state. And then I will relate the trees again. I will come back to the trees and start to connect things in the painting, start to join things. Right now they're strong passages, but they're not quite connected. So this is very typical of my way of working, which is to identify a center of interest at various stages of the painting and return to that center of interest, and then connect the periphery, connect passages that are coming close to the center of interest, extending the idea outward, returning to the center of interest again, defining it more. This sort of back and forth is very typical of the way that I like to work, because it's a constant reminder of, where I want my energy to be, where I want to send my viewer, where I want the story to be told, all these sorts of things. So I go back and forth between the periphery and this area of interest. And it is an area, it's not just one point. It's an area around those broken shadows, the statue, the figures that will eventually be placed on after the shadows dry. So I felt this area was a little too active, so I'm bringing in more shadow to the left side, extending that dark that's in the statue itself, joining it with the trees, with the side of the park, concentrating the smaller lights in between the trees and along the path. So joining and concentrating are sort of what I'm engaged in from this point as I move towards, finalizing the painting. This sort of painting is divergent, a little bit divergent to what we've been doing in a lot of our classes. It's more stylized. It's more of I would say, of a personal or stylized nature. Style always has something to do with the personality or the whims of the artist. So it's a less of a standard painting and more of a stylized painting. And this sort of stylization, I feel, is at the heart of individual expression. We choose the sorts of marks and colors that we like to use, and let the image evolve out of that sort of preference, rather than follow too closely the motif itself in nature, or too closely the photograph, or anything like that. It's more of just enjoying the sorts of things that you enjoy in painting, letting those come to the forefront, embracing them, finding ways to allow them to work within the context of your painting. Being a dry painting and things are drying very quickly, I can start to create some of the edges of the promenade, and with a small brush start to give some detail work in the figure, in the statue itself, start to create the more detailed connections of the trunks of trees to the ground, and this sort of thing. Start to build in more connections and more definitive marks. But it is, I recognize also that it is starting to present a finished quality, and how far to go past this level and add more finish, more definition, more refinement. How far to go with that is the question. If this idea of Twilight is interesting to you, I think as artists it really interests all of us, because it's such a interesting time. A lot of subtlety. In this case we have a lot of drama because the sun is just about to disappear. But after the sun goes down, we get into a different stage of twilight, a very subtle stage where shadows take over. This also could be a great idea for a painting. Some of my favorite artists really painted this time of day or its counterpart, which is dawn, because of those reasons, because of the interesting qualities of light. One of those artists is Whistler, who's considered a tonalist and did a lot of these sorts of paintings along the Thames in England. Nocturnes, as he called them, often dealing with twilight. George Inness, a local painter who also considered a tonalist, did a lot of beautiful paintings of this specific moment in nature when the light is fading and shadows overtaking the scene. Well, at this point, you can see how the shadows have dried and given us that dramatic quality through over the ground and reaching towards those trees that we're painting right now. Background too has dried. That kind of smoky, hazy background has dried, and when we contrast it with these rich darks that we're creating now, we have a real nice quality of light in the background there. Another local painter that created one of the more revered paintings in Boston. The painting of the family feeding some pigeons on the Boston Common in winter time. His name was Child Hassam, and his scene depicts the Boston Commons, I'm sorry, in the 19th century, and one of the most more revered paintings in the collection of the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. It seems that everyone just loves this piece for a variety of reasons. One of the main reasons, I think, is that he captured that twilight sensation so well. So with a smaller brush, we're continuing to join and bring some detail, bring some weight to these forward trees, connect them to the ground, connect them to the shadows, bring them forward, let them fragment as they move upward. Just trying to... Also, we're bringing a bit more blue to these trees so that they join a little more easily with the painting. But I'm still trying to utilize this dry technique, even though we're creating more definite forms at this point. Well, this sort of stuff could go on endlessly, but would not contribute mightily to the scene. So, uh, what I'd like to do at this point is to do some lifting. That means kind of returning to a few spots in the painting, and I want to lift out some of the color so that I get a feeling of light breaking through the trees a little bit, almost like a spotlight. And we see that sort of phenomena or quality occasionally in nature when the air is very heavy, as it is right now, and the light is low. We see those sorts of the rays of light, especially if it's, a little bit of a misty day, as it is today. So the way we do that, I'm taking a flat brush here and finding the angle that I want with just water, dragging it down, pushing the brush into the paper, and kind of loosening the paint in this fashion. I use a flat brush because it gives me a nice sharp edge. The angle is important to describe the movement of light and also to kind of feed back into this idea of the center of interest, to move the eye towards a certain point. So once that water is applied, I return with a little bit of paper towel and press into the paper, drag it down, lift up the water, and at the same time lift up a bit of the paint. And that little bit of removal shows us more of the underpainting, more of that sienna color, gives us a nice warm glow to the shaft of light, the piece of light that's coming through. And I'll do this in a couple areas in the painting, especially on the right-hand side, to kind of finish this area. So this was in the plan from the beginning, but we have to wait until a lot of the darks are placed before we add this. Painting should be relatively dry, but you don't want to let it dry overnight because the paint tends to soak into the fibers of the paper a little more. Yeah, so we're getting quite a light show now, and satisfying. It kind of lines up with the pattern that we have on the ground. This point I want to return to join more of the trees and concentrate those little orange slivers of light that we see on the left side. We're not going to see as much drama on the left side. It doesn't mean that, well, certainly the left side plays a role, sort of a foil, and I would like it to meet a little more thoroughly with the statue. I'd like to concentrate those smaller lights, especially at the bottom of the trees. Build in a few more darks into the trees on the left side before finishing this. The area where I'm going to put some figures is pretty dry. Figures are placed to give us a little more a complete sensation of the scale of the scene, how big the trees are, how big the statue is. It's a little hard to tell now in truth, but when we put in a couple figures, suddenly the scale is implied. Using a bit of burnt sienna, and just a little bit of sepia until I get the figures placed and in line with each other, create the major parts of the figure. It's basically father, son. And the palette doesn't change here either. Perhaps a little bit more of that sienna or even red to set them apart from the cold statue, give them a little bit of a different feel, even though the statue figure is the dominant figure, creating a little bit of a counter to that. Here I'm wondering how much of the benches to put. There's benches that lie in the sides of the park. They'll be practically invisible. I may show the opposing bench with a little bit of brightness, but I'm truly not sure right now. Work around the periphery a little bit to concentrate the light in the subject, make it a little more in that sort of circular area. So that means returning to the periphery a little bit and the upper section as well to add some vignetting or some darker elements. Well, time for the last touches. I'm using a color here called Jaune Brilliant. It's made by Holbein. It's basically white with a little bit of a yellow flavor. This using this instead of white is going to harmonize with the color scheme as it is now, which is this very warm honey-like light that permeates the painting from the ground to the trees to above. So that same sort of light, warm light, should be in the reflections. That's why I'm using this Jaune Brilliant as opposed to a regular white. And it adds another sensation of form to the statue, makes the statue come out a little bit more. We can see the turning shoulders, a hint of the foot in front, the sort of flat planes that catch the light. We'll use that also in the figures, on the shoulders. I'm putting a figure sitting down in a bench. Very abstract, but that little bit of light on the far side is a nice balance to the lights that dominate the right side. Well, the work is pretty much done. Very much done. Overdone? Not really. I might add a bit more blue to some of the strong browns on the right side, but I'm going to let the painting dry before I do any sort of adjusting, I think, because this is going to look a little differently tomorrow. Very pleased with the angled light throughout. I feel that that was one of the major goals in this painting, was to get that shadow pattern, to get the feeling of dried trees overhead, to get the feeling of sort of a misty or smoky light, and I feel that was achieved in this painting. A little bit of adjustment to the angle of this grass. It's a little too sharp. It should be a little flatter feeling through this area.